My criteria was that the expeditionary force to invade Great Britain could only have taken into consideration as a last resource to bend the heart of that nation, as it entailed near impossible methods to execute. In my judgment, the superiority of the Luftwaffe should not have limited itself to the control of the skies, but also there should have been a serious consideration of eliminating the British fleet altogether. My predilection is that we should have opted to wage war exclusively against the naval traffic as a means of preparing Great Britain for a peaceful surrender.
The Army's commanders would not show an excessive enthusiasm for the idea, but despite everything, in the weeks following the French armistice, the German soldiers deployed on the Norman coastline were kept busy carrying out landing manoeuvres which, though few of them found convincing, tried to demonstrate that the landing operation on the English coast was in progress. Time would prove that the concept did not go any further than a simple illusion with which, in the summer of 1940, Hitler tried to take Great Britain to the negotiation table. But early in July, the English would be in charge of making clear their intentions, not doubting in attacking the fleet of its old French allies at Mers el-Kebir.
We had the famous incident when Winston Churchill, Prime Minister by then, tried to get the French fleet to be sent to the States and sort of kept that throughout the war. But the French were not prepared to do this. And there was the famous bombardment in Iran when, in fact, the British Navy had to go through this terrible thing of having to virtually sort of fire at people who had just been allies of the British. And Gibraltar suffered as a result of this. We had retaliation raids by the French.
If, as it appeared, the peace offers did not yield results, the threat of an amphibious landing and the bombings did not weaken the spirit and resistance of the British people, there would be no other solution but to follow the recommendations of Jodl and Reeder and decisively face the need to secure the military defeat over Great Britain by fighting against the vital supply routes that were its link with the Empire. Though a few weeks would have to pass before the Germans increased their offensive against the British merchant traffic, the Wehrmacht's High Command started to look more closely at the possibility of closing the Mediterranean. With a degree of support, perhaps his Italian allies could wipe out the British base of Malta and, advancing from its possessions in Libya, reach Alexandria, the western gateway of its pretended Mare Nostrum. It was evident that the mission of closing this sea from the west, with the takeover of Gibraltar, would have to be assumed by the Wehrmacht. Great Britain was aware of this potential danger and would not take long in escalating efforts of transforming its strategic colony into a fortress. Until then, the British colony of Gibraltar, stronghold of prime importance in the network of maritime routes which linked Great Britain with its empire, and a vital key element, together with Malta and Alexandria, for the domination of the Mediterranean, saw itself almost unaffected by a war which was being decided thousands of miles away.
Gibraltar then was a rallying point for assembling convoys. Convoys used to be assembled here, whether they went into the Mediterranean or they went even across the Atlantic sometimes. They used to assemble here. And they used to go off under escort of H-Force, which H-Force was the Ark Royal, you had the Renown, and you had the Sheffield cruiser, you had the destroyers and so on. They used to go and escort these convoys. They used to go and try and help out Malta.
Nevertheless, with the fall of France, the increase of its defensive capacity had become for the colony's governor, Lieutenant General Sir Clive Liddell, not only a matter of priority, but a vital one. Some time back, the Gibraltarians of military age had been mobilized into a local defense force, whilst the rest of the civilian population, classified by the British as useless mouths, were evacuated. The more fortunate ended up in Jamaica or Madeira. Many others would be accommodated in a London that would not take long to suffer the Luftwaffe's bombings blitz.
I remember that by then people were being evacuated quite thoroughly for the second time. You know, they'd been evacuated to North Africa, to French Morocco, and after that they had to be brought back to Gibraltar, shipped into other vessels and sent off mainly to UK. But others went to places like Tangier, they remained in Tangier, in fact, people who were coming up from Morocco. and others went to Madeira. Some of the families went to Madeira. But Gibraltar's population was thinning out by the time I joined up. I mean, then it was you could see that they were preparing for war. I mean, obviously, in those days, the French had already capitulated.
Now, most of the civilians who were in Gibraltar were the Spanish workers who made up, to a great extent, the workforce at the docks, the port, or the base's naval dockyard. All the significant tactical positions, from the beaches that washed its west side to the sheer heights of the north front, passing through the military installations of its southern half, or the naval dockyard and its port as a whole, had increased its protection. The restricted access areas were covered with minefields, barbed wire and fortified positions, forming a network of resistance points which is particularly impenetrable in the fringe where the old aerodrome lay, extending itself between the bottom of the hill and the so-called Spanish military field. At the same time, the garrison was considerably reinforced. The land troops would increase their numbers with the inclusion of new battalions. To reinforce its anti-aircraft defences, a good number of guns were imported, amongst which were some that had recently been removed from the battlefields of France, whilst shooting exercises, especially those carried out with heavier artillery, were held one after another.
Gibraltar during the war was very, very secretive. Nobody knew what the left hand was doing from the right. If you were working in a certain area, that was it. From home, you went there and back again. You were not allowed to roam around Gibraltar like today, and people had to have passes to go everywhere, even to go to the beach. You needed the pass. I've still got a pass that my dad had for midnight mass.
But despite these preparations, the British did not start to convince themselves that their base on the rock could really be transformed into a fort until the start of some works traditionally linked to Gibraltar's military past. From the autumn of 1940, various excavation and construction companies of the Royal Engineers were sent to the colony with the mission of improving and enlarging the existing network of tunnels, some of which dated back to the 18th century. Gradually, thanks to their efforts and modern equipment to drive these tunnels inside the solid Jurassic limestone, all sorts of barracks, stores, hospitals, workshops, offices, quarters, together with the subterranean city, would slowly begin to take shape. But many months were still necessary to achieve the spectacular underground complex that its designers pursued.
The tunnels were designed for a whole garrison of 16,000 troops to live underground for a period of 9 months, because it was thought that Gibraltar would be besieged by the Germans, U-boats and warships around the straits, preventing any supplies coming in. So preparations had to be made for supplies, ammunition, and all the commodities for a garrison to depend on, to last for at least 9 months without any outside help. The majority of the work, or should we say the fine work, was done by the Royal Engineers. They did all the blasting and all the planning, and all the hard work, the labour, was done by the infantry and the Royal Artillery.
The tunnels in Gibraltar really are immense. There are more tunnels and tunnel space than there are roads. There's something like 26 miles of road surface on the rock, but inside there's over 30 miles of tunnel.
Mainly the Canadians, of course, they had the famous diamond drills, which they were fantastic, magnificent. And you had even a city council lot doing tunneling as well. And you had the Royal Engineers. But there was also, all the garrison had duties of mucking out, because all the tunneling was done by the experts, I mean by the tunnellers, and the city council had, the engineers did a certain amount of tunneling. But when all the spoil was there, we people used to go in and haul this stuff out and throw it out over the side, you know, outside the tunnel. This was done on a 24-hour basis. Some of it was going into the airfield to sort of extend the airstrip, but a lot of it was just going over the side, so to get it quickly out, you know, and getting on with the length of tunneling.
The material produced by these excavation works would be used in the other great construction of a military nature built in the colony during the war, the transformation of the old emergency aerodrome, the building of which had always moved along in a real tightrope, from a diplomatic point of view, into a fully fledged airbase. The progress of the new landing strip's construction provided a good illustration of how the works in the tunnel system evolved. For the moment, a great deal of the usefulness of these works was limited to providing propaganda services, visual arguments with which the British could convince all, and most importantly, convince themselves, that Gibraltar was really an impregnable fortress. The mission was not at all easy. One had in mind how the Deutsche Wochenschau entertained itself, showing what the German assault troops had done to the indestructible Belgian fortress known as Ibn Email on the colossal Maginot Line.
One thing which I'm always very proud of, and I don't like blowing my trumpet, but blowing the trumpet of Gibraltar as a whole, and the people here and the chaps, all the servicemen here, they were the only outpost in the mainland of Europe where the Union Jack flew throughout the war. Nowhere else except little Gibraltar.
In July 1940, facing the need to provide a military solution to the British problem, Yodel's Operations Department wanted to count with a documented reply for the big question: was it possible to capture Gibraltar? And if so, what was the best way to do it? To find an answer to these questions, General Jodl didn't hesitate in making use of the offer made by Franco through Vigon to send to Spain a select group of officials and chiefs of the armed forces headed by the very chief of the intelligence services of the Wehrmacht, Admiral Wilhelm Canaris.
Ironically, what is more dramatic is that Winston Churchill, like all the British people, always reasoned thinking of the seas in its naval routes, in the empire, on the planet, whilst Hitler always reasons thinking on continental Europe and its articulation. Victorious in Poland, France, Hitler didn't finish with the British army in Dunkirk when he could have done, as he desires a mutual Anglo-German peace. He dedicated all his energy and power to the uppercut against the French, who staggered in the knowledge that these stubborn British were returning to their island, meditating on the defeat of their ally, and would seek a compromising peace. The fundamental victory over France, that not even the wisest optimist could have foreseen, has literally intoxicated Hitler, to the point of not realizing that leaving the French their fleet and its empire in North Africa is in itself an overwhelming triumph. He doesn't know how to define nor comprehends the British Empire, a metropolis whose security is based solely on a strong anti-aircraft cover, and above all in the security of the seas that links India via Suez to Gibraltar and Malta, as well as the continental part of Egypt, the Middle East and East Africa, therefore forcing to maintain and support these countries. With the defeat of France, Hitler is convinced that Great Britain will negotiate for peace. He is totally mistaken. Great Britain will not be induced to a compromising peace unless her empire is threatened entirely. Therefore, we should not focus our attention towards an amphibious landing in England, but focus exclusively on conquering both Gibraltar and the Suez Canal. If we succeed in this, then peace would be possible.
Immediately after the French campaign, Admiral Canaris concluded that a surprise blitzkrieg attack on Gibraltar was feasible. The moment was psychologically favourable, as the British were still under the nightmare of Dunkirk and immobilised in their island under the threat of a German landing and the aerial attacks of the Luftwaffe.
Among those called to Berlin were artillery specialists, decorated assault zappers, and even veteran parachutists with a wide experience in airborne operations. Amongst the latter group, there was a young captain from the Luftwaffe assault troops who had recently been decorated with the Knight's Cross by Hitler himself for the capture of the Ibn Email fort. His name was Rudolf Witzig.
It's possible that they can capture Gibraltar with massive help from Spain. It must not be a military help from the Spanish, but more of a political help to guide us past through. Logistics for air control, security against spy operations must be secured. The German weapons, artillery, storm artillery, pioneers, storm pioneers, Luftwaffe, and with Stuka attacks. My conclusion is that we couldn't do it without help from the Spanish.